I took the night mechanic job at a truck stop off I-80 because I needed something that didn't involve people asking questions I didn't want to answer, and nights were the easiest way to get that without having to explain anything to anyone. Day shifts meant drivers standing too close while you worked, trying to start conversations you didn't want to have, asking where you were from and how long you'd been out there like they were going to remember the answer. Nights were different. Trucks came in, got what they needed, and left, and the ones that didn't need anything stayed in their cabs and kept to themselves. That suited me fine. The owner didn't interview me for long. He looked at my hands, asked if I could work alone without calling for help every time something didn't line up perfectly, then handed me a clipboard with a short list of rules and told me I'd understand them after my first shift. Most of it sounded like liability and routine. Don't leave bay doors open. Don't start work on anything that hasn't been logged. Don't go out into the lot after 2 a.m. unless the office calls you out by number. That last one stuck with me more than the rest because nothing about the place suggested I needed permission to step outside. On my second night, a truck rolled in, already running. No headlights, no signal, and no one came out of the cab, and the engine never shut off. The truck stop sat far enough off the highway that you could hear trucks before you saw them, a low diesel hum carrying across the dark long before the headlights showed up over the rise and washed across the pavement. The lot was wide and flat, split into long rows that stretched out past the main building, with the far row barely held together by a couple of sodium lamps that flickered whenever the wind picked up hard enough to push through the open space. The garage itself stayed bright all night, white light over clean concrete, tools laid out in a way that didn't require you to think about where anything was when you needed it. Inside, everything made sense. Every job had a place. Every tool had a function. Every step followed the one before it. Outside, it felt different after a certain hour, like the space got larger without actually changing, like the edges of the lot moved farther away the longer you looked at them. I stayed inside unless I had a reason not to, which was exactly what the rule was for. After 2 a.m., you didn't walk the lot unless the office called you out to a specific truck. The logging system was simple enough that you didn't need training to understand it, but strict enough that you couldn't ignore it without someone noticing. Every truck that came in got entered at the front desk before it ever reached the bays, with a number, a plate, a driver name, and whatever issue they claimed to have if they were coming in for service. By the time it got to me, it already existed in the system, already had a place it belonged, already had a record that tied it to something real. That was the part that mattered more than anything else. If it wasn't logged, you didn't touch it, not to check it, not to take a quick look, not even to confirm what the problem might be. That wasn't about paperwork or liability the way the other rules were. That was one of the lines the owner had pointed to twice before he handed me the keys, like it was the only one he expected me to want to ignore. I didn't ask why. I had worked enough jobs to know that rules like that didn't come from nowhere. The first night passed without anything that stood out. Just a few routine jobs that kept me moving enough that the hours didn't drag. A brake line that needed to be replaced, a hose that had blown under pressure, a driver who stayed in his cab the entire time I worked and didn't say a word, even when I knocked to let him know I was done. That was normal for nights. People didn't come there to talk. They came to keep moving. I logged what I did, closed out the tickets, and stayed inside the light of the garage until the shift ended. The second night started the same way, slow and quiet, the kind of stretch where you could hear the highway breathing in the distance and the steady hum of the refrigeration units behind the building. I checked the system between jobs out of habit, making sure nothing had come in that I hadn't seen yet, making sure every truck in the lot had a record that matched where it was parked. Everything lined up the way it was supposed to. It was just after 2 a.m. when I heard the engine, before I saw the truck. Not loud or aggressive, just steady, already idling like it had been running long before it reached the lot. I looked up at the entrance out of habit, expecting to see headlights sweep across the pavement and catch the edges of the bays as it came in. There weren't any. The truck rolled in dark. No lights, no signal, just the shape of it moving into the edge of the lamps and then settling into a space in the far row without slowing, like it was looking for service. It didn't come toward the garage. It didn't stop near the bays. It went farther out than anything that was actually waiting to be worked on, and stopped there, engine running, positioned just inside the weak light where the rest of the row faded into dark. I waited for the cab door to open. It didn't. I kept watching the truck longer than I needed to, waiting for something that would make it fit into the normal pattern I had already gotten used to. A driver opening the door, a light turning on inside the cab, even a shift in the engine tone that suggested someone was about to move it closer to the bays. None of that happened. It just sat there, idling at a steady rhythm that didn't change, not revving, not dipping, just holding the same sound like it had settled into place before it even stopped moving. I glanced back at the system without thinking, already expecting to see a new entry, something that matched what I was looking at out there. There wasn't anything, no new truck, no late entry, no delay between the desk and the lot. The screen stayed the same, every record already accounted for, every position matched to a number. That was the first moment it didn't line up, and I felt it before I tried to explain it. I told myself it was just a missed entry, something simple that would fix itself once the desk caught up or the driver came in to log it properly. That happened sometimes on busy nights, drivers pulling in before they checked inside, especially if they'd been on the road too long and just wanted to stop moving for a minute. But even then, there were signs. Headlights left on, doors opening, someone stepping out, even just a shadow moving in the cab. This didn't have any of that. The truck stayed dark, except for the faint glow of the dashboard, barely visible through the windshield from where I was standing. I waited another minute, then another, giving it more time than I would have for anything that was actually there for service. Nothing changed. The engine didn't cut. The door didn't open. It just stayed exactly where it was. I checked the time again, not because I needed to know it, but because I already knew what it meant. It was past 2 a.m. That was the line the rule had drawn, the one the owner had pointed at twice before handing me the keys. Don't go out to the lot after 2 a.m. unless the office calls you out by number. I looked back at the truck, sitting in the far row where the light barely held, and then back at the system. There was no number, nothing in the queue, nothing waiting, nothing that connected what I was seeing outside to anything I was allowed to act on inside. That should have been enough to leave it alone. It should have been simple. If it wasn't logged, it didn't exist for me. That was the rule. I turned away from the lot and went back to the bench. picking up a tool I didn't need and setting it back down again, just to give myself something to do that didn't involve looking out there. The garage felt smaller once I stopped watching the truck, like the space pulled back into something normal as soon as I broke focus. I told myself the same thing again, that it wasn't my problem, that if it wasn't in the system, it wasn't mine to deal with, and that whatever was going on out there would resolve on its own the way everything else did. I had worked enough roadside jobs to know that not every situation needed to be handled immediately. Sometimes the right move was to leave it alone. That was what the rule was for. I lasted maybe 3 minutes before I looked back out again. The truck was still there, still in the same position, still idling at the same steady pace, and now that I had tried not to think about it, it stood out more instead of less. I stepped closer to the edge of the garage, not crossing into the lot, just far enough that I could see the cab more clearly without the reflection from the lights behind me. The windshield caught just enough glow from the lamps that I could make out the outline of the interior. There was no movement, no shift in the seat, no silhouette where a driver should have been. I stayed there longer than I should have, just looking, waiting for something to change. It didn't. I didn't go out to the lot that night, not because I wasn't thinking about it, but because the rule stayed in place even when I tried to ignore it. By the time my shift ended, the truck was gone without me ever seeing it leave or hearing the engine change in a way that would have told me it had moved. I checked before shutting down the bays, stepping just far enough toward the opening to see the far row without actually crossing into the lot, and the space where it had been sitting looked exactly the same as everything around it. No dark patch on the pavement, no oil, no sign that anything had been idling there for hours with the engine running. I stayed there longer than I needed to, letting my eyes adjust, scanning the row slowly, like I was looking for something small I might have missed, but there was nothing there to find. When I went back inside, I checked the system again, not quickly, but line by line, making sure I wasn't missing a late entry or a correction. There wasn't anything there either. The next night, I came in earlier than I needed to, not because I was worried about the work, but because I wanted to see if anything had been added to the system that would explain what I had seen. The day mechanic was still there when I walked in, finishing up in one of the bays, and I watched him for a minute before I said anything, trying to decide if it was worth bringing it up at all. He didn't look like someone who wanted to talk, which was normal for the place, but it made it easier to keep it to myself. Instead, I went straight to the system and started going through the previous night's entries, matching them to the times I remembered, looking for anything that didn't line up. Everything was clean. Every truck that had come in had a record. Every record matched a job. There was no gap where that truck should have been. The shift started the same way the others had, slow enough that I had time to think if I let myself, which I tried not to. I stayed inside the garage, kept my focus on the work in front of me, and only checked the lot when I had a reason to. For the first couple of hours, everything lined up the way it was supposed to. Trucks came in, got logged, moved through the bays, and left. Every one of them had a number. Every one of them existed in the system before I ever touched it. That was how it worked. That was how it was supposed to work. After a while, it started to feel like the night before had been something I had read too much into, something that didn't need to carry forward if I didn't let it. It was closer to 2 a.m. when I heard the engine again, and this time I didn't need to look up to recognize it. The sound was the same, steady, even, already settled into an idle that didn't change the way most engines did after a long drive. I stayed where I was for a second longer, letting it register without reacting, then looked toward the entrance. There were no headlights, no sweep of light across the pavement, just the shape of the truck moving into the lot the same way the other one had, dark and already running. It didn't slow near the bays or drift toward the office. It moved past everything that made sense and went straight to the far row again, settling into the same area without stopping to check in. I didn't move this time. I stayed inside the garage and watched it from where I was, already knowing what I would see when I checked the system, but going through the motion anyway, because that was part of how the job worked. The screen didn't change. No new entry, no delayed log, no number connecting that truck to anything inside the building. I kept my eyes on the monitor for a second longer, then looked back out at the lot, watching the truck sit there in the weak light, engine running, no movement in the cab. It wasn't just similar to the night before. It was exact in a way that made it harder to ignore. I stayed where I was, inside the line I wasn't supposed to cross, with the rule sitting in the back of my head like something I didn't need to read again to remember. I stayed where I was longer this time, not because I didn't want to go out there, but because I already knew what stepping into the lot would mean once I crossed that line after 2 a.m. The rule wasn't vague, and it wasn't one of those things you could bend a little and pretend you hadn't broken it. You either stayed inside until you were called, or you didn't. I kept my hand on the edge of the workbench, looking out toward the far row, without moving any closer, letting my eyes adjust to the low light so I could see the cab more clearly. The truck hadn't shifted position at all since it stopped, but the longer I looked at it, the less it felt like it had just arrived. It felt settled, like it had been there longer than I had been watching it. The engine kept running at the same steady idle, no fluctuation, no sign of someone adjusting anything inside, and that was the part that didn't match anything I had worked on before. I checked the system again, even though I already knew what I would find, moving through the entries slower this time, matching the timestamps to the moment I had heard the engine, looking for anything that might have been added without me noticing. There was nothing there. No late log, no correction, no sign that anyone at the desk had seen the truck come in, or even registered that it existed. I kept the screen open and glanced back out at the lot, then back to the system, trying to force the two to line up the way they were supposed to. They didn't. The truck sat outside without a number, without a record, without anything that connected it to the part of the job I was responsible for. That should have been enough to leave it alone. That was the whole point of the rule. I told myself that again, out loud this time, not because I needed to hear it, but because saying it made it feel more solid than just thinking it. If it's not logged, it's not yours. Leave it. That was the line. I turned away from the opening and walked back toward the center of the garage, picking up a tool I didn't need just to give myself something to focus on that wasn't outside. The sound of the engine carried in anyway, low and steady, not loud enough to interrupt anything, but present in a way that made it hard to ignore once I noticed it. I tried to let it fade into the background the way everything else did at night, but it didn't settle the same way. It stayed consistent, holding the same tone without drifting, like it wasn't responding to anything around it. I lasted longer this time before looking back out. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. Long enough that I could tell myself I had given it a chance to resolve on its own. When I stepped back toward the opening, I didn't go any farther than I had before, keeping that same distance between me and the lot like it mattered. The truck was still there, still in the same place, still idling at the same steady pace. But something about it felt different now that I had stepped away and come back. It wasn't closer, not in any way I could measure, but more of it was visible than before, like it had settled deeper into the light without actually moving. I stayed there for a second longer, trying to decide if that was something I had missed earlier, or something that had changed without me noticing. I reached for the radio again and held it in my hand, thumb resting near the button without pressing it, running through the same decision I had made the night before. Call it in or leave it alone. If I called, they would ask for a number, and I didn't have one. If I didn't, it stayed exactly where it was, outside the system, outside anything I was supposed to deal with. I kept my eyes on the truck while I stood there, listening to the engine hold that same steady rhythm, and realized that waiting wasn't changing anything. It hadn't changed the night before, and it wasn't changing now. I lowered the radio without using it and set it back down on the bench, but I didn't step away from the opening this time. I stayed there, looking out at the far row, knowing I was getting closer to breaking the rule without actually crossing it yet. I stayed at the edge of the garage longer than I should have, long enough that standing there stopped feeling like waiting and started feeling like a decision I wasn't making yet. The rule didn't change just because I kept looking at the truck. It was still past 2 a.m., still the far row, still no number tying that thing to anything inside the building. I knew exactly what crossing that line meant, and I knew I had already pushed it as far as I could without actually breaking it. I looked back at the system one more time, giving it one last chance to update on its own, to give me a reason to stay where I was. It didn't. The screen stayed clean, every entry accounted for, nothing new added, nothing delayed. I turned back to the opening, kept my eyes on the truck, and took one step forward, out of the light and into the lot, knowing that once I did it, the rule was already broken whether I went any farther or not. The difference was immediate, not in the truck, but in the way everything around it felt once I stepped into the lot after that hour. The air carried the engine sound differently outside the garage, lower and more direct, like it wasn't passing through anything before it reached me. The lights didn't reach as far as they had from inside either, leaving more of the space between me and the far row in shadow than I expected. I didn't rush it. I moved at the same pace I would have for any normal job, keeping my eyes on the cab, waiting for something to change as I got closer. Nothing did. The engine stayed steady, the truck stayed still, and there was still no movement inside. By the time I was halfway across the lot, I knew I wasn't going to see a driver step out before I got there. I slowed down as I reached the edge of the far row, not because I was unsure of what I was going to do, but because I was trying to give myself one more chance to turn around without making it obvious that I had already committed to it. The truck sat where it had stopped, angled slightly off from the lines, like it hadn't been parked with any real care, just left there. The engine didn't change when I got closer, no adjustment, no drop in idle, no sign that anyone inside had noticed me approach. I stepped up to the side of the cab and stopped there for a second, close enough now that I should have been able to see clearly through the glass. The reflection from the overhead light still made it harder than it should have been, but I could see enough to know what wasn't there. The seat was empty. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking into the cab, waiting for something small to shift that would change what I was seeing into something that made sense. A movement, a shadow, anything that suggested I had missed someone sitting just out of view. There was nothing. The interior stayed still, the wheel untouched, the seat empty, the faint glow from the dashboard, the only thing giving the space any shape at all. I moved slightly to the side, changing the angle, trying to break the reflection, but it didn't reveal anything new. There was no driver, not asleep, not leaning out of view, not hidden by the angle, just an empty cab with the engine running like it had been left that way on purpose. I reached for the door handle before I thought about the rule that came with it. Don't open a cab door unless the driver speaks first. My hand stopped just short of it, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off the metal from the engine running. I stayed there for a second, looking at my own reflection in the window layered over the empty seat inside, and then I looked back toward the garage, the distance between me and the light suddenly feeling longer than it had a minute ago. I knew I had already broken one rule just by coming out here. The second one was right in front of me, simple enough to follow if I stepped back now. I kept my hand where it was, hovering just off the handle, and listened for something from inside the cab that would tell me not to touch it. There was nothing. I stood there with my hand hovering near the handle longer than I should have, long enough that the decision stopped feeling like something I was about to make and started feeling like something that had already been set in place before I got there. The engine kept running, steady and even, not reacting to anything around it, not dropping or shifting the way it should have when I got that close to the cab. I told myself again that if there was no driver, then there was no rule to follow, that the line about waiting for someone to speak didn't apply if there was no one there to speak in the first place. That was enough to push me the rest of the way. I closed my hand around the handle and pulled it open in one motion instead of hesitating through it, like that would make it feel more like a normal part of the job, instead of something I wasn't supposed to be doing. The door opened without resistance, no lock, no delay, just a clean movement that felt exactly like every other truck I had worked on, and that was the first thing that didn't match what I expected. If it had been abandoned or left running by mistake, there should have been something off about it. Instead, everything inside looked set, not messy, not disturbed, just empty. The seat was pushed back slightly, like someone had been sitting there recently, but there was no sign of where they had gone or how long they had been gone. The dashboard lights were on, gauges steady, everything holding in place without fluctuation. I leaned in just wide enough to see the ignition, half expecting to find a key or something that would explain why the engine was still running. There wasn't anything there. No key, no fob, nothing in the slot. I stayed there, leaning into the cab, looking at the ignition longer than I needed to, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with how the system actually worked. Engines didn't stay running without something telling them to. There was always a control, always a mechanism, something physical that connected the machine to the person operating it. This didn't have that. The engine was running, but there was nothing inside the cab that explained why. I reached out without thinking and touched the steering wheel, expecting to feel some kind of feedback, vibration, anything that tied the movement of the engine to something real in front of me. The wheel was steady. No movement, no resistance, nothing that suggested the truck was responding to anything I was doing. The engine didn't change when I leaned farther in. It didn't react when I shifted my weight or when my arm brushed against the dash. It held the same idle it had since the moment I first heard it, like it wasn't connected to anything inside the cab at all. I pulled back slightly and looked around the interior again, slower this time, taking in the details I had missed at first. There were no personal items, no paperwork, no bag, nothing left behind that would normally be there if a driver had stepped away, even for a few minutes. It didn't look abandoned. It looked cleared, like it had been set that way on purpose before it ever rolled into the lot. I stepped back out of the cab, but didn't close the door right away, leaving it open behind me as I looked out across the lot toward the garage. The distance felt longer now than it had when I walked out, like the light had pulled back while I wasn't paying attention. I turned slightly, checking the far edges of the row without fully looking away from the truck, expecting to see something that explained where the driver had gone or why the engine was still running. There was nothing out there either. No movement, no sound, except the steady idle behind me. I reached back and pulled the door shut, the sound of it closing sharper than it should have been in the open space, and stood there for a second longer, realizing I had just broken 2 of the rules without getting anything out of it that made sense. I stayed where I was for a few seconds after closing the cab door, not moving back toward the garage right away, because leaving that truck behind without understanding it felt worse than walking up to it had. The engine kept running exactly the way it had before I touched anything, steady and unchanged, like opening the door and looking inside hadn't mattered at all. That was the part that got under my skin more than the empty seat did. Machines are supposed to respond to contact, even if the response is small. A drop in idle, a shift in vibration, a warning light, something that tells you your hand is on a real system and not just near one. This truck gave me nothing. I turned toward the garage and started walking back, keeping my pace even, because hurrying would have meant admitting I was more rattled than I wanted to be. The distance felt longer going back than it had on the way out, and the light from the bays didn't feel steady until I stepped fully inside it again. Even then, the sound of that engine stayed with me, low and level behind everything else in the room, like it had settled into a place it didn't need permission to occupy. I went straight to the terminal, without stopping at the bench, without taking my gloves off, without doing any of the small things I normally did between jobs. My hands moved to the keyboard automatically, bringing up the active queue the same way they always did after I checked a vehicle in the lot. That was when I saw something that hadn't been there before. There was a new entry at the top of the list, and for a second I just looked at it without opening it, because the problem registered before the details did. It wasn't marked as new. No highlight, no pending flag, no late entry notice from the desk. It just sat there in the queue the way a normal record would, clean and settled into the sequence like it had always belonged there. I moved the cursor over it and opened the file slower than I needed to, already knowing what I was going to find, but needing the screen to say it anyway. The truck was there. Same row, same space, same plate format, Same standard field layout every logged truck used. Whoever entered it hadn't left anything obvious wrong with it. That made it worse. I checked the timestamp first because that was the only part I thought might still betray it. And it did, but not the way I expected. The entry time placed the truck in the system several minutes earlier, before I stepped out of the garage, before I crossed the lot, before I touched the cab door. I stared at that longer than I should have, long enough that the numbers stopped looking like a mistake and started looking fixed, the way everything else in the system always did, once it had been logged and closed into place. I went through the entry field by field after that, not quickly, not skimming, but reading each line the way I would if I were checking somebody else's work for a detail they hoped I would miss. Plate, unit number, row designation, time received. Every part of it was normal in exactly the way I didn't need it to be. There was no desk note attached to explain why it had come in late. No comment from the cashier. No service request. The issue field was blank, but that by itself didn't mean much. Drivers sometimes logged first and explained later. The problem was the order of it. I knew the truck wasn't there when I checked before stepping outside. I knew it wasn't in the system either, because I had looked for exactly that reason, trying to give myself an excuse to stay inside and follow the rule. Now it existed in both places, and the record didn't look added after the fact. It fit too neatly. I backed out to the main queue and checked the surrounding entries, comparing their timestamps to the one attached to the truck. Nothing had shifted to make space for it. Nothing had been pushed down. The sequence held together exactly the way it should have if the truck had always been part of the night. That was what bothered me most. The system hadn't just accepted it. It had made room for it without leaving a seam. I looked back out toward the lot without stepping away from the terminal, the open bay door framing the same stretch of pavement I had crossed a minute earlier. The truck was still there in the far row, still idling at the same steady pace, still angled slightly wrong in the space, like it had never been parked by anyone who cared how it sat. Nothing about it had changed since I came back inside. If anything, it looked more settled than before, less like something that had just pulled in, and more like something that had been waiting there longer than I had realized. I turned back to the screen and opened the entry again, this time paying attention to the smaller details I had ignored at first. The unit number followed the same house format as every other long-haul rig that came through. The plate field was filled cleanly. The arrival time was exact down to the minute. The driver field, though, was blank. Not pending, not unreadable, just empty. I stayed on that line for a second, then longer, because that was the one place the file stopped pretending to be complete. A truck with no driver name should have stood out. In any normal queue, it would have. Here it didn't. It sat in the record like the system had decided that part either didn't matter or had already been answered somewhere I didn't have access to. I moved the cursor over the entry again, without clicking anything else, letting it sit there while I tried to line up what I had seen with what the system was showing me now. The timing still didn't work. The truck hadn't existed in the queue when I checked before going outside. I was sure of that, in the same way you're sure a tool wasn't on the bench before somebody set it there in front of you. It wasn't a vague feeling. It was a sequence I remembered because it had mattered at the time. I had checked the system looking for a number so I could justify staying inside. There hadn't been one. Now there was. and the record placed it there before I made the decision to break the rule and cross the lot. I stayed still long enough to see if anything else would shift on its own, if the system would fill in another field, or move the timestamp, or give me some small sign that it wasn't finished settling. Nothing happened. The entry remained exactly where it was, fixed in place with the kind of quiet certainty the system gave to anything it considered complete. Out in the far row, the engine kept running. Inside the garage, the queue stayed clean. I sat there looking at both, and for the first time since I took the job, it felt like the system wasn't just recording the night. It was getting to it before I did. I didn't react right away when I saw it happen again. I kept my hand on the mouse and stayed on the entry, watching the timeline instead of the lot for once, like I needed to catch the system in the act instead of trying to keep up with it. Another minute passed, then another, long enough that I could feel the time stretching out without anything changing in front of me. Then I heard it again, not the truck itself, but the subtle shift in the sound of the engine, the kind of change you register without thinking about it when you've been around machines long enough. I glanced toward the lot, saw the truck sitting in the same place, and then looked back at the screen. At the same moment, the entry updated. I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't entered a field. I hadn't confirmed a step. The system filled in the next part of the record anyway, adding a status change that matched what I had just heard instead of anything I had done. I stayed still, forcing myself not to click, not to interfere, just to watch it complete the sequence without me. The update didn't come in the way a normal change would. There was no delay, no buffer, no sign that it had passed through the desk before it reached me. It just appeared, clean and finished, like it had always been there, and I had only just noticed it. I leaned closer to the screen without meaning to, reading the line again, checking the timestamp against the clock in the corner of the display. It matched the moment I had heard the shift in the engine, not the moment I was reading it, not the moment I would have logged it if it had been mine to record. That was what made it hard to ignore. The system wasn't just keeping up. It was placing the change at the point it happened, without waiting for me to confirm it, without needing me to see it first. I stayed on that screen longer than I needed to, waiting to see if it would do it again without me giving it a reason. I pulled up another entry to make sure I wasn't reading too much into it, something routine from earlier in the shift that I could compare against, something that would behave the way it was supposed to, so I had a baseline again. The older records held steady, every step tied to an input, every timestamp trailing a confirmation the way it always had. Nothing in them moved on its own. Nothing filled in ahead of me. I went back to the truck's entry and left it open, watching the fields instead of the lot, waiting for another change that I hadn't triggered. For a while, nothing happened. The engine stayed steady outside. The system stayed still inside. And it almost felt like I had imagined the timing of the last update. Then the next shift in the engine came, slight but real, and the screen responded again before I moved, adding another line to the record without waiting for me to touch anything. I kept my hands off the keyboard after that, holding them just above the desk so I couldn't accidentally justify what I was seeing as something I had caused without noticing. The entry continued to build itself, one step at a time, each update tied to something happening outside in the lot, not to anything I was doing inside the garage. I didn't need to look out there anymore to know when it would change. I could hear it first, feel it in the rhythm of the engine, and then see it appear in the system a second later, already placed in the timeline, like it had been recorded in advance. That was the part that settled into me. The delay wasn't between the truck and the system. It was between the system and me. I wasn't leading it. I wasn't even keeping up with it. I was arriving after it had already decided what the record would look like. I looked back toward the lot again after the next update, not because I needed to confirm what I already understood, but because I needed to see the truck still sitting there, unchanged, to make sure I wasn't losing track of what was real and what was just on the screen. It was still in the same position, still idling, still showing no sign of anyone inside the cab. Nothing about it suggested it was doing anything different from what it had been doing since it arrived. The only place the change existed was in the system, in the record that kept building itself without me. I stayed where I was, halfway between the terminal and the opening, listening to the engine and watching the entry update in front of me. And for the first time since I took the job, it felt like the rules weren't there to control what I did. They were there to keep me from seeing how little of it depended on me in the first place. I didn't move right away after that, and it took me a second to understand why my hands weren't going back to the keyboard the way they normally would after any change in a job. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was the realization that there was nothing for me to confirm anymore. The engine shifted again outside, just enough that I caught it in the sound without needing to look, and I watched the entry update on the screen a second later, the new line appearing in place with the same clean structure as everything before it. I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't entered a value or acknowledged a change. The system had already placed it there. I stayed where I was, tracking the timing of it instead of reacting, because that was the only part that still felt measurable. The timestamp matched the moment of the change outside, not the moment I saw it, not the moment I would have logged it if it had been mine to record. That difference settled into me slowly, not as a mistake or a glitch, but as a pattern that didn't depend on anything I was doing anymore. I opened the entry again from the top and read through it without rushing, letting the sequence play out line by line the way it had been built without me. Every step was there, every shift in the engine reflected in a clean update that didn't need input, didn't need confirmation, didn't wait for me to acknowledge it. It looked complete in a way that didn't belong to an active job. Normally, a record only settled once you finished working on something, once every field had been confirmed and closed. This one was settling while it was still happening. I leaned closer to the screen, not because I thought I would find something new, but because I needed to see if anything in it still depended on me being there. Nothing did. The fields were filled, the timeline held, the structure didn't leave space for me to add anything to it. I wasn't behind it. I wasn't ahead of it. I wasn't part of the sequence at all. I stepped back from the terminal after that, not quickly, not like I was pulling away from something, but slowly enough that I could feel the shift in my position instead of just reacting to it. The garage felt different when I wasn't standing over the system, like the space had more depth to it than it had a minute ago, like I had been focusing too narrowly on the screen to notice how everything else was holding together around it. I looked out toward the lot again, letting my eyes settle on the truck instead of the entry, trying to match what I saw outside to what I had just read inside. Nothing about the truck had changed. Same angle, same position, Same steady idle. No movement in the cab. No sign that anything inside it was responding to the changes the system was logging. That was the part that didn't resolve. The record was evolving. The truck wasn't. I moved back toward the terminal, but I didn't go all the way to the desk this time. I stopped a few steps short and watched the screen from a distance, far enough that I couldn't reach it without deciding to step in again. I wanted to see if the system would keep building the record without me standing directly over it, without me being in position to confirm anything, even if I wanted to. The engine shifted again outside, subtle but consistent, and the system responded the same way it had every time since I opened that cab door. A new line appeared, a new timestamp locked into place. The sequence continued. I stayed where I was, watching it happen without touching anything, letting the distance confirm what I had already started to understand. It didn't matter where I stood. It didn't matter whether I was ready for it. The system wasn't using me to move forward. That was when the rule about not working on unlogged trucks stopped sounding like something meant to protect the business or the equipment. It wasn't about mistakes or liability. It was about staying inside a part of the job that still depended on you. The truck had been outside the system when it arrived, and that had been the only moment where it was separate from everything I was responsible for. The moment I stepped out into the lot and opened the cab, it crossed into something else, something that didn't follow the normal order and didn't wait for me to understand it before it placed itself into the record. I stood there between the terminal and the opening, looking at both without moving toward either one, and realized that I hadn't brought it into the system by breaking the rule. I had stepped into a process that was already running, one that didn't need to be logged to exist and didn't need me to keep it going. I stayed where I was for a few seconds after that, not moving toward the terminal and not stepping back into the lot, like the space between those 2 points was the only place left where I could still choose how much of this I was part of. The engine shifted again, and I felt it before I heard it this time. A subtle change in the rhythm that didn't match anything I would have expected from a truck sitting idle that long without anyone in it. I didn't look at the screen right away. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, letting the change settle before I checked if the system would respond the way it had been. When I finally looked, the entry had already updated. The new line was in place, clean and complete. The timestamp fixed at the moment of the change, not the moment I saw it. I hadn't moved. I hadn't touched anything. The system had already placed it there. I stepped closer to the terminal after that, not because I needed to interact with it, but because I wanted to see if there was anything left in the record that still depended on input, anything that would stop if I didn't provide it. I scrolled through the entry slowly, looking for a gap, a pending field, something unfinished that would require me to complete it before the sequence could move forward. There wasn't anything. Every part of it was already structured, already aligned, already moving in a direction that didn't leave space for me to change it. I hovered over the input fields without clicking, watching to see if the system would lock them the way it sometimes did when a job reached a certain point. It didn't. They stayed open, but they didn't matter. I could have typed anything into them, and it wouldn't have changed what was already being recorded. I moved back toward the opening again after that, not crossing into the lot this time, just standing at the edge of the light and looking out at the truck while the system continued to update behind me. I didn't need to see the screen. to know when it would change anymore. The pattern had settled into something predictable in the worst possible way. The engine shifted, and a second later, the record advanced. I watched the cab instead of the terminal, focusing on the empty seat, the steering wheel, the space where someone should have been, if any of this followed the rules I understood. Nothing moved, nothing reacted. The truck held its position the same way it had since it arrived, like the physical part of it had already reached whatever point it needed to reach, and everything else was happening somewhere I couldn't see. I kept my eyes on the truck longer this time, not because I expected it to change, but because I needed to confirm that it wouldn't, that whatever was driving the updates in the system wasn't coming from anything I could point to in front of me. The engine held steady. The cab stayed empty. The position didn't shift. Behind me, the system moved forward again, adding another line to the record without me looking at it, without me confirming it, without me being part of it at all. I turned back toward the terminal slowly, already knowing what I would see before I saw it, and the entry had advanced again, the sequence building itself step by step in a way that didn't require me to understand it to keep going. I stood there, looking at the screen and the lot at the same time, letting both stay in my line of sight without focusing fully on either one, because that was the only way to hold on to the idea that they were still connected. The engine shifted again. The system updated again. The timing stayed exact. I didn't move. I didn't touch anything. I didn't try to interrupt it or correct it or force it into something I could work with. I just watched it continue, the record closing in on a state that felt complete without ever needing me to confirm it. That was when I understood that whatever this was, it didn't start when the truck rolled into the lot, and it didn't depend on anything I had done since. I had stepped into it halfway through, and the only part I had control over was how long I stayed there watching it finish. I didn't try to stop it. That was the first real decision I made after I understood what was happening, and it came easier than anything else had that night. I kept my hands off the keyboard and stayed where I was, watching the system move forward without me, instead of trying to interrupt it or force it back into something I recognized. The engine shifted again outside, steady and controlled, and the entry updated in place a second later, the new line appearing with the same clean structure as the rest of the record. There was no hesitation in it, no delay, no point where it paused to wait for confirmation. It didn't need me. That was clear now. I stayed there long enough to make sure I wasn't going to reach for the terminal out of habit, long enough that the space between action and observation settled into something I could hold without reacting to it. I stepped back from the terminal after that, not quickly, not like I was pulling away from something dangerous, but slowly enough that I could feel the distance increase instead of just seeing it. The screen stayed active behind me, the entry still open, still updating in the same steady sequence that had been building since I came back inside. I didn't turn away from it completely. I kept it in the edge of my vision while I moved, making sure I could still track the changes without standing over them. The engine outside continued to set the rhythm, each shift followed by another line in the record, each line placed exactly where it belonged without me touching anything. The pattern didn't break. It didn't drift. It held together in a way that made it feel finished, even while it was still happening. I moved toward the opening again and stopped just inside the light, looking out at the truck without stepping into the lot this time. The distance between me and the far row felt fixed again, like it had reset to something normal once I stopped trying to cross it. The truck sat in the same position, unchanged, the cab still empty, the engine still running, at that same steady idle that hadn't wavered since it arrived. I stayed there and watched it, not expecting it to move, not expecting anything inside it to change, just confirming that the physical part of it was holding steady while everything else continued somewhere I couldn't reach. That was the separation I hadn't been able to see before. The truck wasn't doing anything new. The system was. I listened to the engine longer than I needed to, not because it was changing, but because it wasn't. And that was the only part of it I could still measure against something real. The sound held steady in a way that didn't drift or respond to anything around it, not to distance, not to time, not to the fact that there was no one inside the cab to manage it. Behind me, the system continued to build the record, each shift in the engine reflected in another line I didn't need to see to know had already been placed. I stayed where I was, at the edge of the garage, letting both exist without trying to connect them anymore, because that was the part that had been pulling me into it since the truck arrived. The more I tried to line them up, the more it felt like I was the one out of position, not the other way around. When I stopped doing that, when I let the truck remain what it was, and the system remain what it was, the pressure eased in a way that made it clear I had been holding on to something that didn't belong to me to begin with. After a while, I stepped back from the opening and moved deeper into the garage. Not quickly, not like I was trying to get away from it, but with the same steady pace I used for everything else in the job, like this was just another point in the shift that didn't need to stand out if I didn't let it. The farther I moved from the lot and the terminal, the more the space settled back into something I recognized. The lights felt stable again. The sound of the building returned to something predictable. The engine was still there, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. I let it stay that way. I didn't go back to the screen. I didn't step outside again. I gave the process the distance it had never needed from me in the first place, and that was enough to keep it from pulling me any farther into it. I stayed there longer than I normally would have on a quiet shift, not working, not checking the system, just letting the time move forward without attaching myself to anything that was happening in it. Every so often, I would hear the engine shift, faint through the structure of the building, and I knew without looking that another line had been added to the record. Another part of the sequence had been placed exactly where it belonged, without me needing to see it happen. I didn't turn around to confirm it. I didn't go back to the terminal to check. I let that part remain out of reach, because the moment I stepped back into it, I knew it would feel like something I needed to understand again, and I had already seen enough to know that understanding it wasn't part of the job I had taken. I don't know exactly when it stopped, and that was the part that stayed with me more than anything else. There wasn't a clear end to it, no moment where the engine cut out in a way that marked the finish, no final update I watched appear on the screen. The sound just faded into something I couldn't separate from everything else in the building anymore, blending into the background until I realized I hadn't been tracking it for a while. That was when I turned back toward the terminal, not because I expected anything new, but because I needed to see what the system had settled into once it finished without me being there to follow it. I walked back to the terminal and looked at the entry without touching anything, reading it from top to bottom the same way I had earlier. But this time there was nothing left unfinished. Every field was filled. Every step was placed. The sequence held together without any gaps or pending points where input would normally be required. It looked complete in the same way a closed job did, but I hadn't closed it. I hadn't confirmed the final step. The last line in the record carried a timestamp that didn't match a moment I remembered marking, a point somewhere between when I stepped away from the terminal and when I stopped tracking the engine altogether. That was where it had finished, and it hadn't needed me to be there when it did. I looked out toward the lot one last time after that, stepping just far enough toward the opening to see the far row without crossing into it again. The space where the truck had been sitting was empty, no different from any other part of the lot, no sign that anything had been there at all. The light held steady across the pavement, the same weak reach from the lamps that had been there all night, but there was nothing in it now. No shape, no movement, no sound. I stayed there for a second longer, letting my eyes move across the row slowly, the same way I had the first time it disappeared, and again there was nothing to catch. When I stepped back inside, the absence of it felt more complete than its presence had. I finished the shift without touching anything else in the system, logging what I was supposed to log, and leaving the rest exactly where it had settled without me. By the time the next mechanic came in, everything looked normal again. The queue clean, the lot empty, the garage holding the same steady light it always did at that hour. I didn't mention the truck. I didn't mention the entry. There wasn't anything I could have said about it that would have fit into the way the job was supposed to work. I signed off, handed over the keys, and walked out while the sky was still dark, the highway sound carrying across the same distance it had the night before. I didn't look back at the lot. I didn't check the system again before I left. I kept moving forward because that was the only part of it that still felt like it belonged to me. I didn't plan on checking the system again after that shift, and for a few days I didn't. I stayed away from the place completely, kept my phone off when I wasn't using it, and didn't give myself a reason to think about what I had seen any more than I had to. That lasted until the third night, when I found myself sitting in my truck outside a different stop farther down the highway, engine off, radio silent, with nothing around me but the same open stretch of road I had been working next to. I don't know what made me do it. Habit, maybe, or the need to see if it had settled into something I could ignore. I logged into the system from my phone, expecting to find nothing out of place, expecting it to look the way it always had when a shift ended clean. It did at first. The queue was empty. The records were closed. No gaps, no missing entries. I scrolled anyway, slower than I needed to, until I reached the last job tied to that night. It was still there, exactly the way I had left it. Same sequence, same timestamps, same closed structure. Then I noticed the final line again, the one I hadn't paid attention to before I walked out. The operator field wasn't blank. It wasn't my name. It wasn't anyone I had seen in the system before. It just sat there, fixed in place like everything else. Operator confirmed. Unit reassigned. The city is quiet now. You should be too.